Welcome to the deep dive. Our journey today takes us back, way back to the ancient Mediterranean. Think of it as this big stage, right? A world really defined by this constant push and pull. On one side, you have this desire for structured law, for order, and on the other, well, the reality was often relentless war, huge financial pressures, and just, widespread lawlessness. Especially on the seas, piracy was a massive issue.
A huge issue. And that's really what our sources dig into. We've got this fascinating stack of legal texts, political writings, histories, and they all sort of chart this centuries-long struggle. We're moving from how the Greeks first started thinking about politics and law philosophically all the way to Rome. And Rome's eventual, well, sometimes pretty brutal enforcement of its imperial power.
And that struggle often centered on the sea, didn't it? The pirates, the trade routes.
Absolutely. That tension, it's the core theme here. The material we're looking at makes one thing crystal clear for any ancient power trying to dominate. Controlling the sea and establishing legal authority were, well, they weren't separate things. They were completely intertwined. You couldn't really have one without the other. Legal control followed naval muscle.
Okay.
So our deep dive today is really focused on unpacking that. How did the first ideas about law even evolve? From these sort of random commands to actual complex doctrines. How did Athens use its navy to basically prop up its entire political and economic system? And then how did Rome ultimately just assert total control? Through a legal system that could be incredibly sophisticated, sure, but also, when things got rough, terrifyingly absolute.
Especially when dealing with those threats like pirates, who Rome famously called hosts humani, generis, enemies of all mankind.
Exactly. They were seen as more than just criminals. They were a fundamental challenge to Roman order, to the idea of a controlled Mediterranean, their Mar Nostrum, our sea.
So we're looking for those moments, those connections that really show how order was imposed and how threats like piracy were dealt with across this huge ancient world.
That's the mission. Finding those aha moments.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. The very concept of law in the, say, pre-classical Greek world, because when we talk about where ancient society started, we're not picturing anything like a modern legal system, are we?
Oh, not even close. I mean, our whole idea of law today is built on predictability, consistency, right? Early ancient society, the sources tell us, it was often regulated by what they called themistes.
Themistes?
Yeah. And these weren't general rules that applied to everyone. Think of them as single, isolated commands, often kind of capricious, just handed down by a king or a patriarch. If the ruler decided something today, well, that was the law for that moment. But it didn't mean he had to decide the same way tomorrow. It was very arbitrary.
That sounds incredibly unstable, especially if you compare it to what we think a real law should be.
Exactly. And the big shift happens when a society gets mature enough, I guess, to see the difference between that kind of arbitrary command and a true law, which the sources define as something, and this is key, that enjoins similar acts on all citizens indifferently.
Indifferently. So the same rule for everyone applied consistently.
That's the breakthrough, the institutionalizing of consistency. When the rule applies to everyone, no matter who they are, and it applies over time, that's when you start seeing real law penetrating society, not just personal commands.
And this initial stage, this sort of rule by whim, it stems directly from the way society was structured back then, this idea of patriarchal despotism.
Absolutely. For a very long time, individuals didn't really live under law as we'd recognize it.
Yeah.
They lived under the control of the head of the family, the patriarch. His whim was effectively the rule within that unit. It wasn't really formal and personal rules. It was more like custom, habit, maybe some kind of instinctual duty. But not a legal duty, because formal law just hadn't reached into the family structure yet. Each family was almost its own little kingdom.
So moving away from that, from the isolated family unit ruled by caprice towards a more formal public system of law, that's really the great Greek discovery of politics you mentioned.
It is, and the sources really emphasize how this shift, particularly in a place like Athens, seemed tied up with this fascination, this value placed on individual liberty.
Ah, Athens.
Yeah, what's really striking is how the source material highlights the sheer, well, the variety and freedom of individual life in Athenian democracy. Personal impulses, tastes, even being quite eccentric.
Yeah.
It was just often tolerated, as long as you stayed within the actual legal boundaries, of course.
So there was a space for individuality.
A huge space.
Yeah.
And you could argue this was the engine for Athens' incredible intellectual and cultural flourishing, this sort of indulgence towards different positive impulses. Difference wasn't necessarily suppressed. Sometimes it was even celebrated, or at least, ignored.
But that very tolerance, that famous Athenian liberty, that was exactly what rubbed some people the wrong way, wasn't it?
Oh, massively. It was a huge point of contention. This Athenian way of life, this tolerance for individual expression, it was constantly being denounced by critics, by censors. And we're talking big names here. Xenophon, Plato, Aristotle. They didn't see liberty. They often dismissed it as democratical license. Chaos, basically.
Democratical license. It's pretty damning.
Well, yeah. For thinkers who admired the Spartan model, the monotonous drill of Sparta where the state demanded conformity, rigid discipline, the Athenian idea of citizens just following their own paths was deeply offensive. They saw it as unstable, anarchy pretending to be freedom. So right there, you see this fundamental clash even over what order actually means in the Greek world. It was a philosophical battleground.
Okay, so while the Greeks are debating the limits of citizenship and individual freedom, the Romans come along, and they're influenced by this Greek thinking, but they seem to take the idea of law and try to make it bigger, universal.
That's a good way to put it. The evolution of Roman legal thought is just fascinating. They were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism figures like Zeno and later Romans like Seneca. And this influence led to a really powerful belief growing among Roman lawyers. They started thinking that the old jus gentium, the law of nations.
Which was like the law that applied between different peoples based on common customs.
Right, practical stuff derived from shared practices. But the Romans started thinking it wasn't just practical. They came to believe it was, in fact, the lost, perfect code of nature itself. Capital N nature.
Wow, okay. That's ambitious. They weren't just tweaking laws, they thought they were rediscovering some kind of universal legal blueprint.
Precisely. This wasn't just legal reform. It was seen as a philosophical restoration. It created this belief that the praetor, the key magistrate handling a lot of the judicial stuff when he was developing his edictal jurisprudence, wasn't just making new law. He was seen as restoring a perfect type, a natural law from which society had sort of fallen away and deteriorated.
So the praetor's job became almost philosophical, to push aside the old, rigid Roman civil law where possible.
Yes, to supersede it as much as possible, to try and revive the institutions of this imagined, pure, primitive state governed by nature. And you can see how this idea would be incredibly useful, right? It gave them a powerful intellectual justification for adapting their laws rapidly to govern this huge, diverse empire they were building. It let them absorb and rationalize different customs under one overarching idea.
And this aspiration, this belief in a higher natural law, it even had an impact on something as fundamental and frankly brutal as slavery in Roman society.
It really did, remarkably. That Stoic influence again. There was this key distinction, deeply rooted in Greek thought but adopted by Romans like Seneca, between someone's legal status and their moral reality.
How did that work in practice?
Well, the argument was that in the realm of the mind, the soul, the master and the slave were fundamentally equal. Legal slavery was just, an accident of fortune, a condition imposed by society. It didn't reflect your inner moral worth.
So the sources suggest this could even flip the script morally.
Absolutely. They argued that the roles could be morally reversed. You could have a legal master who is totally servile in spirit, a slave to his own passions, his anger, his greed. And at the same time, you could have a legal slave who is inwardly free, governed by reason, by philosophy. This Stoic idea became part of Roman thinking, creating this really interesting, enduring tension between the legal condition of servitude and the possibility of inner spiritual freedom. It was quite a radical challenge, philosophically at least, to the master's absolute legal power.
That philosophical background is crucial, but, well, philosophy often bumps up against hard realities, doesn't it? Like military needs, money, getting food on the table. So, shifting gears a bit to hard power, our sources make it absolutely clear. For a state like Athens, controlling the sea wasn't optional, it wasn't a luxury, it was basically the foundation of everything.
It was truly existential for them. Athens was incredibly dependent on maritime trade for almost everything, but especially for grain, for food. And the big Athenian statesman, Pericles, he understood this completely, which is why, back in the mid-5th century BCE, he developed this very clear, very deliberate Western policy.
Okay, tell us about that. What was the aim of this Western policy?
The main goal was to secure Athenian influence in the West, particularly in places like Sicily and southern Italy, and crucially, to counterbalance the power of the Dorian Greeks there. So Pericles made these key alliances with cities that were rivals to the Dorians, places like Leontini and Rhegium, which were Ionian, and also Segesta. These alliances were basically strategic moves against the big Dorian power in the region, Syracuse. And Syracuse, importantly, was the daughter city and strong ally of Athens' main rival back in Greece. Corinth.
Ah, so the big Athens-Corinth rivalry gets exported across the sea. Sicily becomes the battleground almost?
Pretty much. Initially, Athens maybe just wanted a bit of influence, keep an eye on Corinth, make sure trade routes were open. But the dynamics there, commerce, securing those vital grain supplies, the existing rivalries, it all just escalated. What started as seeking influence turned into what the sources call a gigantic struggle centered right there in Sicily.
And naval power was the only way to project influence that far.
It was the only way, the only mechanism Athens had to assert its authority, to enforce its claimed legal right to access those western ports and protected shipping. Without the fleet, the policy was just words.
And this focus on naval supremacy, as you said, wasn't just military maneuvering. It was fundamentally about basics, grain, and also, critically, money.
Yes, and this comes out so clearly during the Peloponnesian War. There's this incredibly telling piece of advice in the sources. The Mytileneans, who had revolted from Athens, advised the Spartans, look, you're not going to beat Athens just by raiding their farms in Attica.
Right, the traditional land warfare approach.
Exactly. The Mytileneans said the real way to win was to hit Athens where it truly hurt. Attack the lands that supplied Athens with its foreign grain. Places far away, like the Black Sea region, the Crimea, areas of modern Ukraine. Disrupting those long-distance sea lands, that was the key to starving Athens out. It showed just how reliant Athens was on maritime supply.
And Athens did suffer a devastating blow later in the war, didn't they? Something that hit both their food and their finances.
Oh, the occupation of Thessalia by the Spartans. It was an absolute disaster for Athens, strategically brilliant by Sparta. It stopped most farming in Attica itself, yes, but maybe even worse, it forced the closure of the Laurian silver mines.
Ah, the famous silver mine.
The source of their wealth.
Yeah.
Those mines were the main reliable source of Athenian state revenue. They produced the silver for their famous coins, the laureate owls. Shutting them down basically cut off the state's primary income stream.
Wow. So food supplies threatened, money supply cut off. That sounds like a recipe for collapse. How did Athens even cope? How did they fund the war effort?
The pressure was immense. It forced Athens into this really radical and politically risky tax reform. They actually abolished the old system of tribute that they demanded from their allies in the Delian League. That tribute had always been a source of huge resentment, right?
Yeah, it made Athens look like an imperial bully.
Exactly. So they scrapped it. And instead, Athens imposed a new mandatory tax, a 5% duty on all imports and exports carried by sea through all the harbors across the entire Confederacy.
5% on all maritime trade? That sounds comprehensive. Like they basically turned their whole sphere of influence into a customs union enforced by their navy.
That's precisely what it was, a politically massive move. It directly converted maritime trade, the very thing their navy protected, into the engine funding the state in the war. And crucially, this tax was also collected in Athens' own port, the Piraeus. So Athenians were paying it too.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the sources suggest this might have been a step towards making Athens seem more like an equal partner, rather than just an overlord. It effectively transformed their maritime dominion into something more like a formal national state, unified by commerce, and this shared tax burden. It put the whole Confederacy's finances onto a single system based purely on the movement of goods by sea.
But even with these massive state fleets trying to control things, the sea remained a pretty wild place, right? Lawlessness persisted. We mentioned piracy earlier.
Oh, absolutely. The need for constant naval patrols, for enforcement, it never went away.
Yeah.
Even during huge crises like the Persian Wars. You'd think everyone would be focused on the Persians, but our sources show Greek fleets still dealing with regional instability, potential threats. For instance, there's an incident where Athenian forces sailed up and attacked and destroyed some Cilician ships they found moored somewhere near Ephetei.
Cilician ships. From Cilicia in modern Turkey. Why attack them during the Persian War?
The sources imply they were seen as a potential threat, maybe suspected of piracy, maybe unauthorized trading, maybe potentially siding with the Persians is not entirely clear, but it highlights how vulnerable any foreign ships were in waters. The Greeks, especially Athens, were trying to dominate. And it shows that asserting control required this constant, sometimes pretty ruthless policing action to secure their strategic backyard.
And this wasn't just an issue in the Aegean. The Western Mediterranean had its own problems with piracy and privateering, didn't it?
Definitely. The sources show the Syracusans, for example, were actively trying to suppress Tyrrhenian privateers, pirates operating off the coast of Italy. It shows that this kind of raiding, this threat to trade, was a chronic issue across the whole Mediterranean, long before Rome became the big naval power. Protecting those sea lanes wasn't just about war. It was about basic economic survival against these non-state actors who could disrupt everything. That's a direct precursor to Rome's later campaigns against the pirates.
And this need for constant assertion, this military follow-through to back up any legal claims or treaties, it just never stopped.
Never. It was relentless. We see it again later on after the main wars. Athens has to send out a commander, a guy named Chares, with a fleet just to enforce an agreement. A local king, Lepidus, had agreed to hand over the entire Chersonese peninsula, but he was dragging his feet. So Chares shows up with ships to, well, encourage compliance.
So treaties were only as good as the fleet enforcing them.
Pretty much. Legal agreements were one thing. Reality on the ground, or rather on the water, required continuous military presence. Asserting control wasn't a single event. It was this ongoing, expensive, decades-long project demanding constant naval readiness and deployment.
Okay, that leads us nicely into looking more closely at the specific kinds of lawlessness that states like Athens and later Rome faced, especially piracy. You mentioned the moral condemnation in Athens. It wasn't just seen as theft, was it?
No, there was a deep, profound moral disgust attached to it. One source paints this really vivid picture of the kind of person who chooses that life, the pleasures they seek. It says these inclinations lead men to slaughter his fellow citizens, enslave himself to tyrants, and join in conspiracies against democracy.
Wow. So becoming a pirate was seen as the ultimate betrayal of the city, of the community.
It was framed as complete treason, the ultimate rejection of civic duty, democratic values, everything the polis stood for. You were basically declaring yourself an enemy of your own people.
It sounds like the worst possible path a citizen could take.
Absolutely. And yet, here's the fascinating contradiction the sources also hint at. Even while piracy is being condemned in the strongest possible terms, Athenian civic life itself, even with all its celebrated freedoms, might have inadvertently created conditions that push some people towards that kind of alternative.
How so? What conditions?
Well, the material suggests that maybe the excessive restraint of law, perhaps meaning the sheer number of rules and obligations, or, even more tellingly, the tyranny of jealous opinion in Athens could have been a factor.
Tyranny of jealous opinion. That's a really striking phrase.
Yeah.
What does that mean practically? How could the democracy that praised liberty also feel like a tyranny?
Think about it. In a direct democracy like Athens, everything was public. Your actions, your wealth, your political stances, your military service, it was all out there, constantly under scrutiny by your fellow citizens. And public opinion could be harsh and often, well, jealous. If you got too wealthy, you were pressured to fund expensive public projects, the liturgies. If you took an unpopular political stand, you could face ostracism or legal challenges.
So constant pressure, constant judgment.
Exactly. The sources seem to suggest that this relentless public gaze, this sort of democratic hyper-monitoring, could actually be psychologically draining, maybe even suffocating for some. So the idea is that the seemingly free life of a pirate outside the law, outside that constant judgment, might have looked like a tempting escape route for certain individuals feeling crushed by the demands of civic life.
That's a really interesting tension, which connects directly to this problem Athens clearly had with the bad citizen, right? The person who just didn't pull their weight.
Yes. And that concern about the bad citizen was intensely focused on military service, which makes sense given how much Athens depended on its citizen army, the hoplites, and especially its navy. The sources clearly attest to people trying to dodge hoplite duty, and crucially, trying to avoid compulsory service as rowers or crew members in the fleet.
And since the fleet was the bedrock of Athenian power and wealth,
Dodging naval service was seen as a direct attack on the state's survival. It was a major concern.
so what could the state actually do about it? What were the legal tools to punish someone for shirking military duty?
Well, the main legal actions were specific indictments. You could bring a graphidelias, an indictment for cowardice, or a graphilipitaxiu for deserting the ranks or failing to report for duty. These were politically sensitive charges, probably not used all that often, maybe more as political weapons sometimes. But if you were found guilty, the penalty was severe. Atimia.
Right, atimia. Explain what that really meant. It wasn't just a fine or something.
Oh, no. Atimia literally means loss of honor, but practically it meant the loss of citizen rights. It was basically civic death. And the sources emphasize that the most crippling part of atimia was losing your right to speak in public in the assembly, in the law courts.
Using your voice.
Exactly. In a direct democracy, where your whole political existence, your identity as a citizen, was tied to your ability to participate, to persuade, to vote. Losing your voice was catastrophic. It effectively made you a non-person politically, a civic ghost. It was a powerful deterrent designed to make citizens think very hard about fulfilling their military obligations.
There was another source of tension around these duties, wasn't there? The fairness issue, the burden on the rich.
Precisely. In Athens, the wealthiest citizens formed what's called the liturgical class. They had the sole legal responsibility for funding really expensive public services. Things like equipping and maintaining a warship, a trireme for a year, or funding dramatic performances at festivals, these were huge financial burdens.
And not always happily borne.
No. The city's institutions often struggled to convince these wealthy elites that the system was fair or that their contributions were properly appreciated. So you see evidence of some wealthy individuals actively trying to dodge these liturgical duties, not necessarily because they couldn't afford it, but perhaps out of a real sense of class unfairness or frustration that the burdens weren't shared more widely. Their private financial interests clashed directly with the public good.
Okay, let's jump forward to Rome now. How did the Roman system deal with crimes against the state, or with the kind of massive systemic corruption we associate with some Roman governors, like stealing a whole province blind?
Rome developed specific legal tools for these, but they often had their own challenges. For treason, or acts against the state, the charge was maiestas, diminishing the majesty of the Roman people. But the law, the lex maiestatis, required the prosecution to prove a really tricky subjective element. You had to show the act was done specifically with the intent to diminish Roman majesty.
Proving intent. Always difficult.
Incredibly difficult in an ancient courtroom setting. It made securing convictions potentially hard, unless the actions were just blatantly obvious.
And what about the governors? The charge of repetundae extortion, that sounds like it was almost an occupational hazard for provincials.
Trials for repetundae were depressingly common, unfortunately. And they often involved not just financial theft, but also sevitia, outright cruelty and abuse of power by the governor. The most famous example, of course, is Cicero's prosecution of Verres, the governor of Sicily. Cicero's speeches against him paint this absolutely damning picture of systemic corruption. Verres wasn't just extorting money. Cicero accuses him of selling judicial decisions, selling justice wholesale, both from Rome and within Sicily itself. He basically commercialized the legal system for his own profit.
Good grief. What does that tell us about the chances of an ordinary person in the provinces getting justice against a powerful Roman official?
It highlights a deep systemic problem, really. It shows just how incredibly difficult, almost impossible it was for someone relatively poor living far from Rome to bring effective charges against a wealthy, politically connected, high-status Roman governor. The corruption wasn't just the governor's actions, it was baked into the power imbalance of the system itself. It made the crime extremely profitable and very hard to punish effectively or consistently. Justice in the provinces often seemed like a luxury available only to the powerful or the very persistent, like Cicero.
So Rome faced these huge challenges enforcing law against external threats like the pirates we mentioned and internal corruption. But maybe the biggest threat to the idea of Roman law actually came from within the state itself, from the way power became increasingly centralized.
That's a really crucial point. As Rome transitions from the Republic to the Empire, the Principate, you definitely see the steady evolution towards more centralized judicial power. And sometimes, terrifyingly absolute power focused on one person. The emperor.
How did that work initially under the first emperors?
Well, in the early Principate, the Senate was sometimes still used as a kind of high court for the empire, dealing with important cases, often involving senators themselves. But, and this is key, any cases that touch upon the emperor's own policies, his direct financial or political interests, or anything concerning his person, those tended to get set aside. Reserved for the emperor's personal hearing, his cognitio.
So the emperor could just decide certain cases were his business alone.
Exactly. And that act of reserving cases immediately created this sphere of untouchable supreme authority. It sent a clear signal. The emperor stands somewhat above, or at least outside, the normal legal machinery when it affects him directly.
And the power of other important officials, even the ones running the city of Rome itself, started to be seen as flowing from the emperor.
Absolutely. The legal theory developed that the jurisdiction of the Senate, when it acted as a court, and crucially, the rapidly growing power of the urban prefect. These were ultimately delegated powers. Their authority originated with the emperor. The urban prefect is a great example. He started out, basically, as Rome's chief of police, keeping order in the city. But over about 2 centuries, that office accumulated more and more judicial responsibility, handling a huge range of cases. He eventually emerged as the emperor's main judicial deputy within Rome, second only to the emperor himself. You see this deliberate consolidation pulling the scattered authorities of the Republic into a single imperial hierarchy.
But the real breakdown, the moment where Roman legal protections truly failed, that happened earlier, didn't it? During the chaos of the late Republic, when the state started granting individuals near absolute power in emergencies.
Yes, this is where the fundamental safeguards of Republican law just collapse under pressure, and it all centers on the failure of one key right: provocatio.
Provocatio ad populum, the appeal to the people.
The citizen's sacred right, the ultimate backstop. It meant a citizen condemned, especially to death or exile, by a magistrate, could appeal that decision to the assembly of the Roman people. It was the core legal protection against arbitrary tyranny by officials.
And what happened to this sacred right during those times of crisis, the civil wars?
It was deliberately suspended. In the special criminal procedures used by dictators like Sulla and later Caesar, and then the triumvirs like Antony and Octavian, the right of provocatio was explicitly set aside. The state, claiming the overwhelming need for decisive action for military or political necessity, simply removed the citizen's most fundamental legal defense against the state's power.
What did that mean in practice? If you were on trial for your life before someone like Caesar acting with dictatorial power?
It meant everything rested exclusively with that one magistrate. His word was final. There was no appeal. The source material gives the example of the trial of Quintus Ligarius before Caesar. Ligarius was accused of fighting against Caesar in Africa. Caesar alone heard the case. Caesar alone delivered the judgment. Life or death decided by one man's will, with no recourse to any other legal body or the people. It was personal and absolute.
And Sulla, perhaps the first of those great, terrifying figures of the late Republic, he took this to the absolute extreme with his prescriptions, didn't he?
The prescriptions, they represent the complete legalized abandonment of due process. Sulla, wielding dictatorial power, essentially issued mass death sentences. He did it simply by posting lists in public names of his political enemies. If your name was on the list, you were condemned to death, your property confiscated.
With no trial, no hearing.
Often, yes. No public hearing, no chance to offer a defense, and critically, absolutely no possibility of provocatio, no appeal. It was summary execution sanctioned by the state itself.
So Roman citizenship, this thing they prized so highly, offered zero protection if the dictator declared you an enemy.
None whatsoever. And the sources add this chilling detail. In some cases, the public announcement of the sentence, the posting of the name, only happened after the person had already been hunted down and killed.
That's horrific.
It was the ultimate assertion of absolute, non-reviewable state power over the life and death of its citizens. It was like a terrifying return to those ancient capricious themistys, those single commands, but now wielded with the ruthless efficiency of the Roman state machine. The supposed need to enforce order was used to justify the total destruction of the legal order itself.
It's an incredible dark irony, isn't it? The state, in its quest to impose absolute order, especially against internal enemies, ends up committing the ultimate act of lawlessness itself.
That really is the tragic takeaway from this part of the material. Law wasn't ultimately defeated by pirates from Cilicia or foreign kings. In these moments, it was overthrown by the exceptional power granted to its own supposed guardians. #outro.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've navigated this really complex relationship between, high-minded legal theory and the often brutal realities of military power and control. We started with the very birth of legal philosophy in Greece, saw how vital naval control was for Athens funding its democracy, feeding its people. We explored the deep moral outrage against things like piracy.
And watched how Rome tried to take these ideas and build something universal, this concept of natural law, but also how they used law, and sometimes abandoned it, to assert raw power.
Especially in their long fight to control the Mediterranean, to turn it into their Mare Nostrum, dealing with threats like the pirates who constantly challenge that control.
Yeah, and what this deep dive really underscores, I think, is that achieving that ideal, that stable Roman lake, it wasn't just about winning sea battles. It was a constant legal project, too. It required this relentless assertion of authority over trade, over their own citizens, and certainly over those destabilizing elements like pirates and privateers. And sometimes asserting that authority meant pushing legality right to its absolute limit, or even beyond.
The need to maintain order, especially securing essentials like the grain supply and keeping the economy running, it clearly came at a huge potential cost to the very legal principles Rome claimed to champion.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty stark question to think about, doesn't it? We've seen how easily the rule of law, even supposedly sacred rights like provocatio, could be swept aside by perceived necessity, or just by the personal will of powerful individuals. So when Rome's own leaders, the Sullas, the Caesars, the triumvirs, suspended those rights and embraced dictatorial power to crush their enemies, did the Roman state itself, in those moments, become the biggest hostess, the biggest enemy to its own citizens?
Arguably even more of a threat than the pirates they were fighting.
Perhaps. Did the quest for supreme order end up consuming the very legal protections it was supposed to uphold? It really makes you consider the true internal price of imposing absolute control, something to mull over.